Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the World Explorer podcast. This is the podcast where some days we take a random prompt and create an entire world of it, and others we take a random topic and discuss it. As you could probably imagine, that we are going to be doing the second thing today. That was very badly sentence structured, and I apologize, but I'm just gonna go with it.
Lurp glop.
Yeah. Yes, that's...
Morning, John. Grow flan. Sing ye bish stick signal. That's what we're talking about today.
Did you just, insult, 5 different languages?
I don't mention. Say few flan. So yeah, we're talking about languages today. I'm gonna...
Maybe...
And how to world build them.
Yeah. So...
And sort of like all the different nuances that comes with them. There's a lot of implications that comes with world building languages, because it's really easy and it's really simple to go and start world building a language by just saying, I'm gonna have some ancient magic words that'll pop up from time to time, and maybe the old wise wizard knows a few, and it's just a bunch of gibberish that you throw in there, and it's like, this random bunch of characters forms this random word to make this random spell happen. And that's about as far as some world building for languages go. But you can take this much further, and you can actually, in your story, create a much more cohesive structure to what your language would be like. And not even to just necessarily come up with all the different grammatical rules for your language and stuff, but you can... go into what kinds of implications different languages can have, how that can affect culture, how that affects communication, how that affects all sorts of things. Where does the language come from? How does language change over time? There's a whole lot that goes into world building language, because language in real life is complicated.
Especially English.
English is dumb and I hate it. I don't know why we all speak it.
Oh, do you want to know why? This could actually pertain, honestly, to writing languages, but the reason why English has become such a universal language, and is the same reason why it's so stupidly hard to learn, and that is that it absorbs the languages of other cultures. So in England, you have a lot of inspiration from France and Germany, and so that affects how English is spoken there. In Australia, you kind of have your own people living together, so different words breathe out of that, so their English is very separate. And in America, we have a lot of influence, again, from France because of Canada above us, but also a lot of influence from Spanish, which affects how we speak, and that's why there are so many different dialects of English, but also why it does so well is because when someone from a different language comes into our land, instead of shunning them and saying, oh, you have to learn our language, we actually start adopting their language into English and kind of making a hybrid, so people are encouraged to learn it better, and then it becomes this universal thing. It's fascinating, really.
It's also kind of dumb. As fascinating as it is, and it's dumb, because English makes no sense when you combine all the different languages.
Yeah, but it encourages people to learn it more, but it's also, if we didn't do that, then it wouldn't be the universal language, and then none of us would have learned it. Who knows what we were speaking?
Yeah, that's an example of language changing over time.
Which almost all languages do. I dare you to try and read something in Old English. I personally can, but that's because I've been trained to do it. That's right, it takes training to read English that's older than 2,000 years ago, so...
By the way, we're not talking about, say, Shakespeare and that
No, we're talking Beowulf.
That's early... Yeah, Shakespeare is early modern English.
Yeah.
We're talking about Beowulf. I barely understand Shakespeare.
I understand Shakespeare perfectly, so... But... Again, I've been trained and raised to understand Old English, so I can personally read Beowulf, and what's the other big one of that era that I've forgotten the name of, which I have on my shelf somewhere, but there's a bunch of others from that era that you can read pretty well, and stuff. Like, but if you struggle to read King James version, forget about trying to read the original Beowulf. Don't even try. So yes, so languages change over time. So if you are writing a story that's more global, that's something to think about. And then of course the other thing, like with a lot of language such as English and French and Spanish that spread across many nations, having the idea that in your world different dialogues of a language are going to be present. So having characters from different areas have different words for the same item despite speaking the same language is a very common thing in our world, and therefore something people would expect to see in yours, just because that's how people and language works.
Okay, so here's an example of what might happen if, say, let's say that you had your peaceful little civilization on an island or a continent or something, and they spoke their own language. And then you had another a group of people, an army or a different country or something, come in and invade and take over the land. Generally, what would happen in that sort of scenario is that the conquerors would now have the dominant language in that area, and they would force it upon the locals. And very often when you have, like, this is an area where I could potentially see languages being mixed.
Yeah, so this is like one of those examples in which, despite the fact that another reason why English is so predominant is that it is the language of the conquerors, and which isn't always great history for it, but because of that means that they are language spoken by those who are in power, and therefore the ones that will be forced on others. But at the same time, languages are so deeply enriched in culture and ideas that they tend to survive even when a culture dies out through language. So even though, like, some of these cultures are long gone, they still remain in the winner's language as words were changed to adapt for them. Especially if you discover, like, new plants or areas, they tend to keep the language of the area that they're in. So a lot of our, like, our words and stuff of random things reflects whatever language that those items came from, which is fun.
What else do we want to world build in terms of language, or explain on how it's done?
We could talk about, like, the amount of language that you want to change. So something fun is you don't always have to go, like, crazy and try to create an entirely new language that is then, like, your story's being translated from, quotation marks.
Tolkien!
Like Tolkien did. You know, Tolkien's extra, and we all appreciate him for being extra, but we don't all need to be that major about it. We could do things like, so one of the games that I play on my channel is called Ooblets, and literally all they do is they take, like, items and they just make weird word versions of it, and that's their community's language. So it's like a weird version of English where everything has weird names and stuff, and it's really fun and it's really cute, and it adds a lot to the game and the experience. And usually as a reader who's reading, like, the scripts and the dialogues and the item names, you can catch on what they're actually saying pretty easily. Like, they have little houses which are kind of like coops for us, and they just call them coops, so it's pretty easy. Like, money is called gummies, so you can kind of see where they came from, that. Things like that. So they're little subtle changes that are pretty easy to follow and don't need much explaining, but they can add a lot to, like, the character and dynamic of a world. So you don't have to go crazy. It can be something as small as that.
I don't know where to go beyond this.
I mean, I can keep going.
Hold on, I'm gonna go watch Hello Future Me and listen to him talk about language. I think he did that one time.
Well, I mean, we could also... So what about slang? Like, what's your idea of using slang and, like, dating your book with it?
Okay, so... slang tips... I mean, you could end up dating your book. I think that there are some words that you can really get away with using fairly well. Saying things like, hey, my man, my bro, what's up? You know, something like that. That's going to be around a while.
Yeah, possibly.
And I think that sort of thing is fine. I mean, in a sense, you could say that something like Shakespeare is dated because he talks in a way that we don't talk anymore.
Yeah.
But people still enjoy it. And I
Well,
think
here's the thing about
fine.
Shakespeare. Shakespeare made up his own. Shakespeare's a linguist. He made up his own words to make it sound better, but people had no clue what they meant. He invented a ton of words that are now
Which is
like
kind of
common.
hilarious.
Yeah, which are now common use today. Like we still use some of the words he invented. It's great.
Yeah, but what I'm about to say isn't so much language, but it is more dialogue
Mm-hmm.
related because that's just sort of what came into my mind when you were talking about slang. When I'm writing characters, I generally try to give them different styles, like different types of words that they would use. For example, you might have your really smart character not use contractions. Like your scientist guy might not use contractions because that's just how he talks.
Yeah.
You might have your guy who's just like out on the streets. It gets into a lot of gang fights and things. He might use a lot of slang and a lot of contractions and maybe some curse words and like, all these different things. But that's less language. That's more just dialogue and
I mean, that's
writing and
dialogue and
keeping characters distinct from each other.
dialogue is a part of language. Like it's a huge part, especially when writing in literature. Because the truth of the matter is, majority of people who are writing are going to just write in one language. They're not going to be diving into different languages. That's usually something that's saved for fantasy worlds, and even then, it's saved as, like you said in the beginning, for like spells and stuff. And like having a full language is cool, but for the most part, you can get away with making up words and calling it a day. Um, Something that I know, like I personally use in one of my stories, I use Hebrew a lot throughout of it, but that's me taking from a very real language to build upon my own personal world's culture and stuff. So yeah, that's something you could do. But at the end of the day, you're gonna write in your native tongue usually, or some people write in their second language, but you're gonna write in the language you're most comfortable writing in and speaking in, just because that's what makes sense, and that's what everyone does. So it's very hard. There's not much point in writing a book in a language no one's gonna be able to read. Like, why would you do that? Like, no, no, like why? So that means the biggest part of language in your writing is going to be dialogue and stuff like that. Like, how are your characters speaking? Do you want to use slang? But also, there's this whole thing of accessibility for readers. Like, if you use a lot of slang and stuff like that and then don't explain what those words mean, are you going to lose readers that way? Or, like, I know a huge thing for a lot of classic literature and why they don't like it is that something that was done in a lot of classic literature is the dialogue of especially slaves and those of the African American culture, and the trying to write out what they sounded like, and that being very difficult to read and understand, and some people finding that very demeaning towards those people, even if that might have been how they talked. It made them seem less than human and very unfair, and so a huge criticism to a lot of classic literature is that being done. But at the same time, like, if you're trying to portray accuracy of someone's accent, is maybe that is something you want to do, and you have to think about that. And how are you going to be judged for how your character speaks in 100 years? Because some authors are being banned for it, which I think is kind of ridiculous, personally. But yeah.
Yeah, like it wasn't offensive. It's based on what people are offended by,
Yeah.
and a book that wasn't offensive 10 years ago and everybody loved, if it's offensive today, suddenly it gets banned.
Yeah, which is a whole dialogue on its own that I am. If anyone like sees my channel and like some of my book based things, videos they've done, they all know that I'm very huge against. I'm very prominent in being against that actions towards books. I think you should read a book with their historical context in mind before you judge it. Always before you judge it. I also think we're very hypocritical on books, too. Like, someone like Mark Twain gets trashed even though he was, like, revolutionary in African American rights, while someone like Lovecraft is still praised despite him being so racist. The KKK clan did not want to be associated with him because they thought he was too extreme. Like,
yeah, it's amazing how that happens.
Yeah, but like we all still, praise Lovecraft for all he's done, but we ban Mark Twain's books. because
I
they
think it's because
seem...
he used the N-word.
Yeah, we forget about Lovecraft and the KKK clan saying he was too much for him. The people who would burn people at the stake said he was too much.
How do you become more racist than that? Just saying.
Exactly. Like, so we have this like double standard on authors, and it's absurd. And you know, like here's an author who is actually racist for his time and is therefore very racist for our time, and yet this other person who's like very pro, let's get these guys educated, let's get them on equal standings for us, is dragged in the mud because he had to work with the timeline he was given, and he had to portray them rising up from the lowest society because they were in the lowest society, and you have to raise them up. And he did a lot of that through language, so how his characters speak to each other and through each other, and that there is this distinction between his African American characters and his white characters. They speak different, they talk different, but at the same time, them like coming up. But at the same time, he also does it with class. So I'm thinking of Huckleberry Finn and how Finn's dialogue is very broken up and honestly very similar to this to the free slave that he's on the raft with throughout it. I don't remember his name and I feel bad. It's been a while since I've read this book. Who he's with. Their dialogue is extremely similar, and that's because he was using that to show a comparison between how low-class whites are on the same playing field as these free slaves, and how both of them can be risen up to the level that Tom Sawyer's at, and how we all have to work together to equalize the field and through education, and that some people aren't going to want that education, are going to be content with the lower class they are in, and that's also okay, and stuff like that. It was extremely revolutionary for his time. He got tons of criticism for it, and I think it's a shame he's getting criticism now for this like revolutionary ideas. But he used language to prove his point, and I think that's great, and that's a great way to show how, like, language in a story can actually be used to, I don't know, politicize it and make it even better and elevate it to a level that it wouldn't have been. Like, I feel like he did a good job in using his dialogue compared to other novelists who it just makes it hard to read. Can you tell, like... I've written reports on Mark Twain and Laura Ingalls as two people who are wrongly criticized or attacked for things they shouldn't be attacked for. So, yeah.
Yeah, Mark Twain was great.
Oh, I'd love to say Mark
Twain. This is a little bit off topic, but there was a quote from Mark Twain that was put onto a sign. I can't remember what it was, but it was a quote, something about proving the existence of God, and it was. But now Mark Twain was not a Christian.
Yeah.
He was very much like he was like anti-Christian, like in a way that not like he hated Christians, but he did dispute the Bible constantly. Yeah. And there was the quote that he made about God that somehow found itself onto a wall hanger decoration in a Christian store.
Yeah, I'm
like... Because somebody misinterpreted his quote.
Yeah, I'm kind of like...
I'm going to see if I can find it.
I know, I was looking up too. I'm sorry, this Mark Twain quote just made me laugh. God created wars so that Americans would learn geography. What? It's true though, but it was so funny. I'm sorry.
That is hilarious.
That's so good. He has such good quotes. Mark Twain is a fascinating person to study. If you gain anything from this podcast, like go read about Mark Twain's life and all that he did and stuff.
At least I'm pretty sure that Mark Twain was not a Christian, but at the same time, I'm getting quotes like God put something good and lovable in every man his hands create.
I think so. Mark Twain had like a thing against Christians that like I have against a lot of Christians today, in that they are very hypocritical. Like they preach one thing and don't say something. So like another quote of his is, "If Jesus were alive today, the last thing he'd be is a Christian," is something that he said. And like, yeah, He would. So yeah, like, and I'm afraid there's like truth to that. There's Christianity has become this thing that's very dividing, and that wasn't the point. It was supposed to be accepting and loving and all these things, and it's not anymore. And if anything, it's pushing people away from God instead of bringing them closer to Him, which is awful. So I don't know if he was. I don't fully know where his faith is. There's a lot of debate in that. So, but he was a fascinating man, and I have a huge respect for him. And you know, he's one of those people. Like, if I had an opportunity to have a dinner with him, I would totally take it. Cause, dude, he was so fascinating. Like, it's by the goodness of God that in our country we have those three unspeakably precious things: freedom of speech, freedom of consciousness, and the prudence never to practice either of them. Only one thing is impossible for God: to find any sense in the copyright law on the planet. I love this man so much.
I just found one. I believe that our Heavenly Father invented man because he was disappointed in the monkey.
Yeah. If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. I mean, that's valid. Like,
okay, I just found a quote from Mark Twain. It says, "In God we trust. I don't believe it would sound any better if it were true."
yeah.
Like, his quotes sound like Christian quotes, but
I know, he was very skeptical about it. I've never actually dived into, like, Mark Twain's life as much as I wanted to. He's definitely one of those authors on my list to do it, but I've done other authors instead, so, but, yeah, he's a great writer. He's got some amazing quotes. So it's just a fun time. But yeah, Mark Twain is an example of someone who uses language very powerfully and dialogue and stuff, and a good example of that. So go read Huckleberry Finn, and while you're doing it, look to see how he uses language, because you'll be surprised how he does it. It's very impressive.
okay, I just looked up to see if he was a Christian, and the first thing that comes up is a quote from Mark Twain that says that it claims that he is a Christian.
Yeah, I don't think he was Christian in, like, the sense of, like, he associated with himself with a domination and was all that. I think he believed in God. I'm pretty sure he believed in God, but I'm not sure he believed so much in church.
Well,
or what church had become.
It says, Twain writes in another letter, "My conduct is above reproach in a worldly sense, and finally, I now claim that I am a Christian."
Well, I love the idea I can have a conversation with him in heaven about his writing and his influence on the world. So I'd welcome that.
Yeah, if you can get past the long line.
Oh my goodness, that's very true. That's very true. That's okay. Saying. We'll have all eternity. Eventually, I'll get a turn. I can wait. Everyone will get a turn to chat with Mark Twain. That should be our goals in life. Everyone's goal in life should be to do something so remarkable and amazing that when they go to heaven, there's going to be a long line of people wanting to talk to them about it. Like, there's something ambitious to work towards. But we got very off topic. I'm trying to think. Let's think about, like, other authors who we could talk about. Tolkien and his use of language. The one thing is, he, like, invented this entire language and then doesn't really use it in the book.
Yeah, he barely ever uses it. Like, he uses it a little bit. Like, things like Minas Tirith.
Yeah.
I believe it's the word Minas actually means tower.
Yeah.
And Tirith, I don't remember.
I don't know either.
But
yeah.
he did create a language with all these words, and then he combines these words to create some sort of a meaning to reflect, like, the landscape. For example, you might have a word for mountaintop, and let's say that your word for mountaintop was Molra, and your word for big house was Devi. So you might have a big house on a mountaintop called Mora Devi.
Yeah. Yeah, what always blows my mind about this is that there's people in the world who can actually speak the language that he created. Like, they taught themselves to, like, speak and read it and stuff. And I'm like, why?
They're as crazy as Tolkien was.
That's very
Just
true.
saying.
That's very true. But yeah, so I mean, there's more power to them, I guess. But at least I feel like me being able to read Old English has a use in that there's a bunch of books written in Old English that I can now read. Tolkien's language, there's like three, and it's barely used, so there really isn't much point in knowing this language. But it's also like what's the Star Trek language that's like fully developed that some people can speak? Klingon.
The Vulcans.
It's like Klingon or something like that.
Klingon, that's it. Yeah, Klingon.
Yeah, like that entire. Like,
I don't watch Star Trek.
I don't either. But like I know that there's people out there who can like speak that, and I'm just like, why? But then again, I spent years of my life learning Latin, and that's a dead language. But at the same time, I'm in history. That's like the world I'm into. So learning dead language is very helpful for that type of stuff. And at least, it was prominent in the culture. But then again, I guess one can argue that fantasy worlds and, like, people who are associated with them has become a culture in itself. So, like, there is a bunch of people who can speak Klingon and can speak whatever. Tolkien's language, I think, has a name. I just don't know what it is.
I have no clue.
Yeah. They can speak that. And now they've kind of made their own little communities, and they can speak their language amongst each other. And I don't know, if that's the community you want and you want to be a part of that, then like more power to you. There's worse things you could be spending your time on, I guess. I see nothing wrong with it. I just think it's not my cup of tea personally. But
I speak Pig Latin.
I can understand and translate Pig Latin if you give me an hour. But I can't like full out speak it.
I mean, I'm not super fluent in it, but like I can speak it, just not fast.
Yeah, you have to think about it. I could probably write something in Pig Latin if, again, I was given time. But Pig Latin follows a pattern. That's very easy to understand, and therefore very easy to catch on to. Which, is another helpful tip if you're making a language, having a pattern that readers can catch on to pretty quickly. That will allow them to catch on to your language. Because that's the thing, like,
but don't make it a simple variation of English. Don't make it like Pig Latin, where it's just English, but you changed two things.
I mean, if you want to, but...
You can. It's just kind of dumb. It's very obvious that that's what you did. And it doesn't feel like the sort of thing that would appear naturally. It feels like a forced creation.
Yeah. And another thing is, if you do use, like, foreign languages and stuff like that, or made-up languages, you have to explain it to people. If you're doing it for names of areas and places, you usually don't. You can get away with weird names. But if you're using it, like, they use a word in a sentence, and your viewers have no clue what it is, and then they go and they look it up, because some will, like, I highlight words I don't know, and then I look them up later. And then they don't find them online because it doesn't exist. And then they finish your book and that word's never defined to them. That kind of takes away from the enjoyment of the book. Not gonna lie. I get frustrated with books that do that, where they throw these words at me and I can't find out what they mean. It was like my issue with Dragon Prince, where they had the girl signing this whole, what I'm sure was a very emotional tribute to her sister. And since there were no subtitles and it was a not great animated show, like quality-wise, and sign language has so much variance, there's no way for me to really ever know what she was saying. And I was very upset by that, and it marred my enjoyment, at least of that episode. So, you gotta be careful of that.
Do we have anything else to say on language?
I don't know, I feel like this episode turned into more of me talking about how much I like Mark Twain.
Yeah, that's kind of where it went. But I told you going into this, there wasn't going to be much to discuss.
Yeah, language is a simple thing.
Unless you're prepared for it.
Yeah.
It's super complex, and yet there's not much for us to mention, it seems.
Yeah, it's a simple thing. Maybe it's time we do like a shorter video to make up for our very long tangents of the last episode we did, which was a lot, so,
Sure.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm happy. I'm happy anytime I get to talk about Mark Twain. So personally, so I'm good. But, yeah, next week we'll have a very special episode. It's been over 6 months since we had a random world, so, like, a weird craziness, so mentally prepare yourself for that. I know I will be spending my week trying to mentally
When
prepare
she
myself
says
for it.
random, she means insane nonsense.
Yes, so he'll be throwing things at me, and I will be trying to throw logic back, and then he'll throw more craziness at me, and it's kind of a battle of wits, and it's a good time. So logic versus craziness. What can we create from it? It's always a personal favorite for both of us, so I'm looking forward to it, and hopefully you guys will be too. But we will be ending this podcast here. See you guys next week. Bye.
Michelangelo.
Ooh, art is a language. There's a topic.